It's 1960. Detroit is obsessed with power. Everywhere you look, engines are getting bigger, louder, and thirstier. V8s are the kings of the road. Horsepower numbers are bragging rights. Chrome is currency. And if your car doesn't rumble at idle, people assume something is wrong with it. This was the golden age of American muscle. The era when Pontiac was about to drop the GTO, when Ford was cooking up the 427, when Chevrolet was stuffing big blocks into anything with four wheels. Dealerships weren't selling transportation. They were selling power, status, speed, and then Dodge does something that sounds almost embarrassing. They build a six-cylinder engine, they tilt it sideways, and they put it in everything. Most people laughed. The automotive press didn't take it seriously. Customers looked at it and saw a compromise, a budget option, something you settled for when you couldn't afford the real thing. In an era when even grocery getters were expected to have some rumble, a leaning six-cylinder seemed like a step backward. What they didn't know was that this weird, leaning little engine was about to earn one of the most unlikely reputations in automotive history. A reputation for surviving abuse that would kill almost anything else. A reputation for running when it shouldn't. For outlasting the car around it. For becoming the cockroach of the automotive world. This is the real story of how Dodge's Slant Six earned a reputation no one expected. And once you hear what it went through, you'll never look at a six-cylinder the same way again. Back in the late 1950s, Chrysler was in a strange position. On one hand, they were engineering monsters. The Hemi had already proven that Chrysler knew how to build brutal, dominant V8s. That legendary engine had dominated NASCAR tracks and drag strips alike. It had earned Chrysler a reputation for power that rivaled anyone in Detroit. But on the other hand, the market was shifting. Gas prices were creeping up, imports were coming. Volkswagen was selling Beetles by the thousands. Small European cars were starting to appear in American driveways, and not everyone wanted or could afford a big V8 just to commute to work. The average American family was changing too. Suburbs were expanding, commutes were getting longer, and suddenly, fuel economy started to matter in ways it hadn't before. Chrysler's executives saw the writing on the wall. They needed something different, something practical. Chrysler needed a modern inline-six, something smooth, something compact, something cheap to build, but also something tough enough to carry the company's reputation. They couldn't afford to build something that would break down and embarrass the brand. Chrysler's name meant quality. Whatever they built, it had to last. So the engineers started from scratch. They didn't want an old flathead design. Those were relics of the past. They wanted overhead valves, they wanted efficiency, and they wanted durability that bordered on ridiculous. They studied what other manufacturers were doing, they looked at European designs, they analyzed failure points in existing engines, and then they started making decisions that would set this engine apart. That's when someone made a bold call. Instead of standing the engine straight up like every other inline-six, they leaned it over. 30 degrees to the right. It was unconventional. It looked weird, and it changed everything. That single decision defined the engine's entire character. By slanting the block, they could lower the hood line. That meant sleeker cars without sacrificing displacement. Designers loved it because it gave them more freedom. It also allowed for longer intake runners and better airflow, all while keeping the engine compact enough to fit in smaller engine bays. The slant created a more direct path from the carburetor to the combustion chambers, improving fuel distribution across all 6 cylinders. It looked strange. Mechanics weren't sure what to think. Customers definitely weren't impressed. When you opened the hood and saw an engine leaning to one side, it almost looked like something was wrong, like it had been installed incorrectly. A slanted six just didn't sound exciting. It didn't look exciting either, but Chrysler wasn't building for excitement. They were building for something else entirely. The first version debuted for the 1960 model year. It displaced 170 cubic inches. That's about 2.8 liters. Bore and stroke measured 3.40 inches by 3.125 inches. Compression ratios hovered around 8.5 to 1, depending on the year. Power output, around 101 horsepower. Nothing flashy, nothing brag-worthy. 100 horsepower in 1960 was barely enough to get anyone's attention. You couldn't win races with it. You couldn't brag to your neighbors about it. It was basic, utilitarian, and completely unremarkable on paper. But that wasn't the point. Soon after, Dodge introduced the bigger version, the one that would become legendary, the 225 cubic inch Slant Six, a 340-inch bore paired with a long 4.125-inch stroke. That long stroke gave it torque right off idle, around 215 pound-feet in early trims, the kind of low-end grunt that made the car feel responsive even at low speeds. Horsepower climbed to roughly 145 in its best factory configuration. Still modest on paper, still nothing to write home about. In an era where V8s were pushing well past 300 horsepower in performance trims, 145 seemed almost quaint. But paper doesn't tell the whole story. What really mattered was how they built it. The Slant Six block was massive, not lightweight aluminum, cast iron. Heavy, thick, and incredibly strong. Cylinder walls were thick enough to handle overboring if needed. Deep skirts reinforced the bottom end. 7 main bearings supporting the crankshaft, when many competitors were still using 4 or 5. That extra support meant less flex, less vibration, less stress on the rotating assembly. The crank itself was forged steel in early years. Not cast, forged. That alone tells you what Chrysler was thinking. Forging a crankshaft costs more. It takes more time, but it creates a stronger, denser piece of metal that can handle abuse that would crack a cast crank. Chrysler wasn't cutting corners. They were overbuilding from day one. Oil passages were generous, wide enough to flow plenty of oil even when things got hot. Cooling jackets were thick and consistent, designed to prevent hot spots that could warp the head or crack the block. The valve train was simple and understressed. Push rods and rocker arms that could handle far more than they would ever be asked to do. Even the cam profile was conservative, designed to favor longevity over peak output. It wasn't going to win any races in stock form, but it was going to survive. And that lean angle, it wasn't just for packaging. The 30-degree slant helped oil drain back to the pan more efficiently at sustained RPM, reducing oil aeration and starvation. When the engine was running hard, oil didn't foam up and lose its lubricating properties as easily. It stayed where it was supposed to be, doing its job. None of this made headlines, but it made something else: engines that refused to die. At first, the Slant Six was just another base engine. Taxi fleets ordered it because it was cheap. Delivery companies bought it because it was simple. Farmers liked it because it started every morning, no matter how cold the barn got. Government agencies put it in service vehicles because it was easy to maintain. Nobody expected anything special. It was just a workhorse. And then the stories started. Mechanics noticed something strange. These engines came in with 150,000 miles, then 200,000, then 300,000, no rebuilds, no major failures, just oil changes and basic maintenance. Sometimes, not even that. Shops saw Slant Sixes that hadn't had fresh oil in years. Engines caked in grime and neglect that still ran smooth. Engines that should have seized but somehow didn't. The mechanics would shake their heads and wonder what Chrysler had put in these things. There are documented cases of Slant Six engines running with almost no oil pressure, engines that overheated so badly the paint burned off the hood, engines that ran for hours with cracked blocks or blown head gaskets, coolant and oil mixing in ways that should have destroyed them. And they just kept going. One Dodge engineer reportedly joked, "We built it for the customer who never opens the hood." He wasn't wrong, but the real test came from abuse no engineer could design for. Taxis in New York and Chicago ran these engines 24 hours a day, multiple shifts, multiple drivers, stop-and-go traffic that cooked the engine, heat soak that baked the intake and carburetor, cold starts on winter mornings when the wind chill was below zero. bad fuel from questionable gas stations, long idle times when drivers waited for fares, still running. Rural delivery trucks bounced them down dirt roads that would shake bolts loose. Construction companies ran them at redline with overloaded vans hauling materials to job sites. Police departments used them in pursuit vehicles that saw hard duty. Students bought them cheap and ignored maintenance entirely. Changed the oil maybe once a year, maybe not at all. Ran them on bald tires and old spark plugs and whatever cheap fuel they could find. And the Slant Six just took it. By the late 1960s, its reputation was spreading quietly. Not through ads. Chrysler wasn't running commercials bragging about durability. The word spread through mechanics, through fleet managers, through used car lots, through word of mouth. If it's got a Slant Six, it'll get you home. That became the saying. You could trust it. It might not be fast, but it would get you there. But here's where it gets really interesting. Because people assume the Slant Six was boring. And in stock form, yeah, it kind of was. It was designed to be boring. That was the whole point. But underneath that conservative tune was a bottom end strong enough to embarrass V8s. Hot rodders started to notice. The forged crank, the thick block, the 7 main bearings. This thing could handle RPM and boost far beyond what Chrysler ever intended. The same features that made it reliable also made it incredibly strong. Drag racers began experimenting, with multiple carburetors stacked on custom intake manifolds, with aggressive cams that would have destroyed lesser engines, with headers and exhaust setups designed for power, with turbochargers and superchargers bolted onto an engine that was never designed for forced induction. And the engine didn't flinch. It took everything they threw at it and asked for more. In 1960 and 1961, Chrysler themselves proved what the engine could do. They offered something called the Hyper Pack, a factory performance package for the Slant Six that included a 4-barrel carburetor, a long branch intake manifold, a hotter camshaft, and better exhaust. The Hyper Pack turned the humble 170 cubic inch engine into something unexpected. It dominated NHRA A stock class so completely that the competition complained. The sanctioning body actually had to reclassify the cars just to level the playing field. That's how good it was. In the mid-1960s, Chrysler went even further. They built factory race versions of the Slant Six for NASCAR's compact class. With modified heads, higher compression, and better breathing, these engines pushed well over 200 horsepower, in some cases closer to 250, from a 6-cylinder. At tracks like Daytona and Charlotte, Slant Six powered cars started winning races they had no business winning. They revved higher than expected, they ran cooler than expected, and most importantly, they finished races while others blew up. Reliability in racing is just as important as speed. You can't win if you don't finish. One NASCAR mechanic reportedly said, "You could hear the V8s dying, the Sixes just kept humming." While flashier engines scattered connecting rods across the track, the Slant Six just kept turning laps. Then came the ultimate insult. People started turbocharging them in the street. With basic draw-through setups that would have destroyed lesser engines, Slant Six engines survived 10, 12, even 15 psi of boost on stock internals. No forged pistons, no upgraded rods, just the same parts that came from the factory, handling pressure they were never designed for. The long stroke and strong crank handled torque loads that snapped weaker engines in half. Some builds pushed well past 300 horsepower. A few crazy builders went even further. Superchargers, nitrous, combinations that made no sense on paper but worked because the bottom end could take it. At that point, the engine wasn't just durable, it was legendary. But why? Why did this engine survive what killed so many others? It comes down to philosophy. Chrysler engineers assumed the worst. They assumed poor maintenance, low oil, bad fuel, constant load, owners who never checked anything, drivers who redlined the engine every day, so they overbuilt everything. They didn't chase lightweight castings or razor-thin tolerances. They chased margin, safety, survivability. Every design decision prioritized durability over performance. Instead of feeding oil to the valve train first, they prioritized the crank and mains. The critical rotating parts got oil before anything else. Instead of pushing compression to the edge for maximum power, they kept it conservative. Instead of shaving weight to improve fuel economy, they added material wherever they could. It wasn't sexy, but it worked. By the early 1970s, emissions regulations and fuel economy rules changed the game. The government started cracking down on pollution. New standards meant lower compression ratios, leaner fuel mixtures, less power. Compression ratios dropped. Power fell. The Slant Six went from 145 horsepower down closer to 100 in some trims. Electronic ignition replaced points, which was actually an improvement, but leaner carburetors hurt throttle response. The engine felt slower, even if it was cleaner. But even then, the engine kept its core strength. The same block, the same crank, the same overbuilt foundation. It might have been slower, but it was still just as tough. Maybe tougher, since the lower compression put less stress on the internals. Production continued all the way into the late 1980s, nearly 30 years on the assembly line. Millions of engines built, installed in everything from A-body Darts and Valiants to B-body sedans, pickup trucks, commercial vans, and fleet vehicles. 3 decades. That's almost unheard of for an engine design. And when Chrysler finally retired it in 1987, it wasn't because it failed. It was because the world changed. Fuel injection was becoming standard. Front-wheel drive was taking over. New manufacturing methods made different designs more practical. The old pushrod inline-six didn't fit the new reality of automotive engineering. The Slant Six didn't fit anymore, but that doesn't mean it was forgotten. Today, its legacy is almost mythical. People tell stories about engines that ran without coolant, engines that ran after sitting in a barn for a decade with mice living in the air cleaner, engines that survived being hydro-locked when water got sucked into the intake, engines that were overheated, abused, neglected, and mistreated beyond all reason, and kept running. Are all those stories true? Maybe not all of them, but enough are. Collectors still hunt for early forged crank versions. They pay premiums for unmolested examples with original parts. Drag racers still build boosted Slant Sixes just to prove a point, to show that you don't need a big V8 to make serious power. And mechanics still smile when they see one roll into the shop, because they know this isn't an engine that demands attention, it earns respect. The Dodge Slant Six was never supposed to be a hero. It wasn't built to dominate headlines or win beauty contests. It was built to work, to survive, to quietly do its job day after day, year after year, decade after decade. And in doing that, it became something far more powerful than a muscle car icon. It became trustworthy. In a world obsessed with horsepower numbers and quarter-mile times, the Slant Six proved something else mattered just as much: longevity, engineering honesty, and the kind of toughness you don't notice until everything else has already failed. That's how Dodge's Slant Six earned a reputation no one expected. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of the toughest engines ever built, let me know in the comments what story you want next. Another forgotten engine, a rivalry, a mechanical underdog that changed the game, and make sure to subscribe because there are plenty more legends hiding in plain sight.